Hello and welcome to TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya and we're here in Yerevan, Armenia at the 108th Rose-Roth seminar, a part of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And my guest here today is Nigar Göksel, the director of the Turkey-Cyprus International Crisis Group. Nigar, it's so nice for you to accept speaking to us here today. So I was lucky enough to listen to your speech today the session was called Peace Agreement Between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Way Ahead and Remaining Challenges. You really spoke about, I think this seminar is coming the first, right after the peace agreement, the latest peace agreement signed by President Ilham Aliyev, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, and President Donald Trump. But let me ask you firstly, how does Turkey view this latest peace agreement and its potential impact on the stability that it would be able to bring in the region?
Okay, well, thank you for having me. Actually, what they did in Washington was initial an agreement that they'd already bilaterally negotiated. And I think that's an important factor because from Turkey's perspective, the fact that the two leaders bilaterally agreed on that text was quite significant. What's a little bit more controversial is the United States brokering the routes that would run from Azerbaijan to its exclave Nakhchivan via Armenia. Having U.S. presence so close to Turkey's borders, a little bit, some circles in Turkey don't love the idea.
Does Turkey feel threatened that an external partner would actually be building this or helping to?
It's not a matter of threat, but there's sort of a history of the United States getting involved in a neighbor of Turkey's and then sort of departing and leaving instability. They sort of see that somewhat as having happened in Georgia, but much more so in Iraq and a little bit in Syria. Of course, Syria now has sort of pulled together, but there was a long time when Turkey sort of was not happy about the U.S. policy towards Syria. So there's a little bit of that, but I think there's also a recognition that had the United States not gotten involved, that route would have been difficult to open, because it's not like there was another actor that would be able to deter the countries that do not want that route to go forward, Iran and Russia foremost. So I think there's also a recognition that it was the best of the available options. And to answer your question, I think Turkey sees potential to be a more important strategic hub, because essentially if Armenia and Azerbaijan reach peace, which it looks like they will, and they're able to open their borders and have transport routes and energy routes and cables, electricity, data, then Turkey and Anatolia in itself is going to be the route through which these run, all the way from Central Asia to Europe. So in terms of strategic importance, it's a dividend for Turkey, and it's also, of course, an economic it'll be an economic beneficiary. And of course, Turkey has some rivals in the Caucasus. Russia has been a rival. Right. And Turkey's sort of weakness vis-a-vis Russia was that it didn't have relations or open borders with one of the three South Caucasus countries. So if Armenia and Azerbaijan can reach peace and Turkey can normalize its relations with Armenia, then it'll be it'll be able to probably get a stronger footing in the Caucasus with its soft power, with its business potential in time.
Russia would possibly lose its position, right, in its vying for power in the South Caucasus as well. Let me ask you this, Nigar. You mentioned in your speech the importance of connectivity and debate between Armenia, between Azerbaijan. Now, there was a Turkish delegation that was in Armenia recently. How did Turkey view that, and what can you tell us about that?
Well, Turkey, I think the route that they've been talking about is the one that is now called the Trump route.
For international peace and prosperity.
Yes, TRIP for short. It looks like that's the first route that's going to be ready. But one of the points that I was trying to make was that other routes will also be necessary, because essentially that route transits Armenia and it goes through its south, but there are many other railways left over from Soviet time or that could be constructed from scratch that would really fold Armenia into a web of connectivity. And I think also for European partners to finance and support it, it's important for Armenia to be included in this sort of new wave of connectivity. And from Turkey's perspective, of course, it's very positive. These routes bypass Iran, they bypass Russia, they increase Turkey's relative reach in the region.
Now, if we go back to the peace agreement that was signed in Washington a month ago, do you think any concrete steps have already begun being implemented?
I mean, there has been significant, very palpable change in rhetoric. You see that in Baku and also in Ankara.
How so?
Well, from Baku, for example, the language has changed dramatically. I mean, there's the language of adversarial sort of placement of Armenia has all. I mean, I haven't followed every day, but it's all but disappeared. It looks like. And from Turkey as well, you can see Foreign Minister Fidan last week was saying that he appreciated the bold steps that Armenia was taking, and he reiterated that Turkey would be speedily opening its borders with Armenia after Armenia and Azerbaijan finalize or sign their peace agreement that they've initialed. So, I mean, I think the atmosphere has become more positive. You see much less fear of war in Armenia. Pakistan recognized Armenia. That was an important established diplomatic relations. It was an important step, and it didn't happen without Azerbaijan and Turkey's, particularly Azerbaijan's, green light. So I think Azerbaijan and Turkey are going to be looking for ways until they open their borders to keep some kind of a momentum alive, so that it doesn't feel like there's a stall.
Let's talk about, actually, you spoke about the normalization, of course, of ties. And in a way, another thing that was mentioned by one of the other panelists as well was also reconciliation, pain, how to put that aside. I mean, and with both nations, right, both with Azerbaijanis and with Armenians, what are the biggest challenges on the human level at this point where we stand now, where Azerbaijan and Armenia stand today with this agreement?
I mean, their war is quite fresh, and so whenever Armenians talk about the refugee Karabahis, Azerbaijanis will bring up the hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis that were displaced for almost 30 years. So, they're still in a little bit of a tit for tat. I had more pain, no, I had more pain. And then, of course, you also have the grievances of Armenians from East Anatolia. So, in a way, there's a sort of tangle of victimhoods, and it's hard to know where to start. I mean, right now, it's really official level normalization, but once that signature is placed and the borders start opening, one really has to start focusing on the human dimension as well.
You spoke about, with whatever it is you just said, I remember you spoke about the importance of later on, about education, about society, about possibly how, I mean, what I want to know on that, if you can just elaborate a little bit more, how do you think that would look like? Say the borders open, will, Azerbaijanis and Armenians be able to peacefully visit and travel to each other's countries, territories, without any, like you said, or grievances or hate, even in how to put aside, right, this threat? I mean, certain Armenians post-2023 feel that felt unsafe to stay, right? When, if I do remember correctly, Azerbaijan said that they would provide them with citizenship or passports, and Armenians felt threatened, and Azerbaijanis on their end, would feel the same way. How do we get past that?
It's going to take time. I mean, the idea is, of course, that the borders would open and people would be able to travel freely. But, I mean, when you think about it, they've been geared at war for a long time, and it's not going to change overnight. I mean, the education systems, the language in the school books needs to be adjusted as well. And then, of course, you're going to have oppositions, you're going to have saboteurs that try to feed off of this hatred. So it's not going to be easy, but there are experiences, and actually European countries have experiences with post-conflict peace building, of trauma, with healing. I mean, sometimes it's psychological work, sometimes it's work that brings you together to find things that are similar in your culture, in your sort of community sense. So I think, it's not going to be easy, but we see it a little bit with Armenians and Turks now that it's been some years that Armenians travel to Turkey. Of course, sometimes there are discomforts when Armenians will go to their grandmothers' homes and start, complaining about their loss, and that can sometimes trigger incidents. But I think what's important is that if you have a sort of political maturity to try to deal, you have to let them happen a little bit. I mean, you can't repress people from expressing their anger, but try to put a lid on it so that it doesn't spark into violence.
And Nigar, finally, how does Turkey view Armenia's deepening partnership with NATO, and how do you feel that the conference here today shapes that or helps these relations flourish?
I thought it was noteworthy that there were 4 or 5 Turkish MPs as well present, and as well as one of the NATO representatives giving the keynote speech was Turkish. I think that sort of was a normalizer in terms of not being a bilateral, thorny topic for them to be together, but together talking about security issues under a NATO framework. By and large, I think when it comes to NATO, Turkey is probably comfortable to the extent that they don't think that Russia is going to want to spoil. I think there's a little bit of a concern in Turkey sometimes that if it looks like the West is coming in to elbow out Russia, then the West and Turkey are not ready to match Russia's levers. Armenia is still quite dependent on Russia in a number of sectors, and energy, wheat. So sometimes you'll hear the logic of, if we're not ready to support Armenia and give it the economic lifeline or the security lifeline that it needs if Russia decides to push back, then we need to tread a little bit more carefully. You have that factor when it comes to NATO. When it comes to the EU, of course, you have a different factor, because then you'll have Turkey worried about another small Christian country going closer to the EU, sort of like replicating the Cyprus example, where Turkey will be left out and there'll be an arc of countries that are in the EU sort of ganging up against Turkey. So you have certain fears, but I think by and large, Prime Minister Pashinyan's diversification of foreign policy and standing his ground vis-a-vis Russia are by and large appreciated.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nigar Göksel, Director of Turkey-Cyprus International Crisis Group, for being with us here today on TVP World. And that's all for us here from Yerevan in Armenia at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.